The room was louder than it should have been, not with voices, with judgment. Plastic chairs scraped against the floor, someone coughed, a phone vibrated and then stopped. I remember the smell of cheap coffee and dust, like the place hadn't been cleaned in years. Everyone was seated in a half circle, facing me, like I was about to be evaluated instead of heard. I wasn't supposed to speak yet. I was just standing there, holding my bag too tightly, trying to look normal, trying to look calm, trying not to look like what I actually was, tired, stretched thin, and one bad sentence away from breaking. Then it happened. Not shouted, not whispered, said casually, almost bored. Stop playing the victim. No gasp, no objection, just a few nods, one smirk. Someone actually laughed, softly, like it was a clever comment. My ears rang not from noise, but from the sudden absence of it, the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing. I felt heat rush to my face, then drain just as fast, leaving me cold and exposed. I didn't respond, not because I didn't have words, but because every word I had ever swallowed suddenly crowded my throat at once. Years of staying quiet, years of doing more than I could afford, emotionally, physically, financially. Years of convincing myself that if I just endured a little longer, things would balance out. All of it reduced to one sentence: victim. I looked around the room, searching faces I thought were safe, faces I had trusted with my exhaustion, with my children, with my secrets. What I saw instead was distance, calculation, relief that the spotlight wasn't on them. No one asked why I was hurting. No one asked what I had lost. They had already decided. My hands were shaking, but I locked my fingers together to hide it. I focused on the clock on the wall, its second hand ticking too loudly, like it was counting something down. Maybe my dignity, maybe my patience. I realized then that this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a verdict. And the most painful part wasn't the accusation. It was knowing that the people who benefited most from my silence were the ones telling me to keep it. So I stood there, saying nothing, because somewhere deep inside me, a thought surfaced, quiet, dangerous, and irreversible. If they were this comfortable dismissing my pain, what else had they been lying about? I didn't plan to become a single mother. No one does. It's not something you grow up dreaming about or write in a notebook as a future goal. It happened slowly at first, through compromises, excuses, and the belief that love will eventually meet you halfway. When it didn't, I was already standing alone. I remember the first night it became real. The house felt too quiet, like even the walls were holding their breath. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing while my child slept in the next room. That was the moment I understood something permanent had shifted. There would be no backup, no safety net. If I fell, there would be no one behind me to catch us. So I didn't fall. I learned how to survive on little sleep and even less reassurance. I learned how to stretch money until it felt unreal. I learned how to smile in public and cry only when the door was locked. Every decision I made passed through one filter. Will this protect my child? I said no to things I wanted. I stayed quiet when I should have defended myself. I accepted help that came with invisible strings attached. At first, my family stepped in, or at least that's how it looked. They offered advice, opinions, occasional support. I was grateful, too grateful. I didn't notice how quickly concern turned into control, how "we're just worried about you" slowly became "you wouldn't survive without us." I let it happen because I was tired, because I was afraid, because being judged felt better than being abandoned completely. They saw my exhaustion before I did. They knew my weak spots, and they framed it as care. I worked longer hours, came home later, slept less. I missed meals so my child wouldn't. I wore the same clothes longer than I should have, told myself appearances didn't matter anymore. I told myself sacrifice was temporary. But something subtle began to change. My choices were questioned. My boundaries were ignored. My struggles were discussed in rooms I wasn't invited into. If I looked overwhelmed, I was dramatic. If I stayed quiet, I was passive-aggressive. If I spoke up, I was ungrateful. There was no version of me that felt acceptable anymore. Still, I trusted them, or maybe I needed to. I convinced myself that family wouldn't cross certain lines, that even if they didn't fully understand me, they wouldn't turn my pain into entertainment. There were moments, small ones, when something felt off. A look exchanged when I walked into a room, conversations that stopped when I arrived, decisions made for me, not with me. I noticed, I felt it, and I ignored it. Because questioning them meant questioning everything I had built my survival on. I told myself I was imagining things, that stress was distorting my perception, that once things stabilized, the tension would fade. What I didn't realize was that the story of me, the struggling, emotional, unstable single mother, was already being written without my consent. And by the time I sensed the ink had dried, I was already standing on the wrong side of it. The betrayal didn't arrive all at once. It slipped in quietly, disguised as routine. I remember the day clearly because nothing about it felt important at first. I was already exhausted before it began. My mind was on deadlines, groceries, school schedules, survival details that never pause. When I walked into the room, I expected another conversation wrapped in concern, another reminder of how hard things had become. What I didn't expect was the shift in energy. The air felt tight, like something had already been decided. Chairs were arranged too neatly. People avoided my eyes, not out of kindness, but preparation. I felt it in my stomach before my mind caught up. They weren't there to help me. They were there to correct me. It started subtly, a recap of my recent behavior, a list of worries framed as facts. Words like emotional, unstable, overwhelmed were used freely, without malice in their tone, but with precision. Each label landed heavier than the last. I listened, nodding, trying to keep up. Then came the moment I couldn't rationalize. Something deeply personal, something I had shared in confidence during one of my lowest nights, was repeated out loud, not as a concern, not as a private fear, but as evidence. That's when my chest tightened. I looked around, waiting for someone to stop it, to say this wasn't okay, to remember that I was human, not a case study. Instead, heads nodded, pens moved, the room absorbed my vulnerability like it belonged to them now. I realized I wasn't being heard. I was being documented. My thoughts raced, trying to find logic. They mean well. They're worried. This is distress. But denial couldn't drown out the feeling crawling up my spine, the unmistakable sensation of being betrayed by people who knew exactly where it would hurt. I wanted to interrupt, to explain context, to clarify the parts they twisted, but every time I opened my mouth, the words felt fragile, small, unconvincing against the confidence with which they spoke about me. I saw it then. They had been talking about me long before this moment. They had compared notes. They had shaped a version of me that fit their comfort, and I hadn't been invited to any of it. The realization hit harder than anger, harder than sadness. It was humiliation. Not loud, not explosive, the quiet kind that seeps in and makes you question your own memory, your own emotions, your own reality. I sat there, nodding again, while my thoughts screamed. I replayed every conversation, every late-night confession, every moment I had trusted them with my truth. Each one now felt exposed, repurposed, and weaponized. A part of me still wanted to believe there had been a mistake, that someone would catch it, correct it, apologize. No one did. That was the moment the betrayal became undeniable. Not because they spoke against me, but because they never once asked me if what they believed was true. And as the meeting ended with polite smiles and controlled voices, I understood something chilling. They weren't confused about me. They were certain, and I was the only one in the room who hadn't known the story had already been written. After that day, nothing was openly said, but everything changed. The pressure didn't come in dramatic confrontations. It came in pauses, in glances that lasted a second too long, in advice that sounded optional but wasn't. I felt it every time I entered a room, and conversations subtly adjusted around me, like furniture being moved without my permission. I started noticing patterns I couldn't unsee, questions that felt more like inspections, reminders disguised as concern, suggestions that left no room for refusal. Every choice I made suddenly required justification. If I stayed late at work, it was irresponsible. If I came home early, I was avoiding responsibility. No matter what I did, it confirmed the version of me they had already agreed upon. I began second-guessing myself. I reread messages before sending them. I rehearsed responses in my head. I minimized my emotions until they barely registered. It felt safer that way. But safety came at a cost. I felt watched, not constantly, but enough to keep my shoulders tense, enough to make me aware of my tone, my posture, my facial expressions. Even my silence was interpreted, especially my silence. What hurt most was how normal it all looked from the outside. No shouting, no threats, no obvious cruelty, just a steady, invisible tightening. I was still expected to show up, to help, to contribute, to be grateful. My role hadn't disappeared, it had just become conditional. Support was no longer support, it was leverage. And I was trapped between needing it and resenting it. Late at night, after my child was asleep, I replayed conversations in my head. I searched for the moment I must have failed, the moment I gave them permission to see me this way. I wondered if exhaustion had made me careless, if vulnerability had been a mistake. I told myself to endure. Just get through this phase. Just don't react. Just keep things calm. But calm felt like erasure. I noticed how quickly my instincts were dismissed, how often decisions were made without me, then presented as favors. I was informed, not consulted, corrected, not supported. There were moments I wanted to scream, not in anger, but in protest, to say, I am still here, I am still capable, I am still me. Instead, I smiled, I complied, I waited. The tension followed me everywhere, even in places that used to feel safe. I felt it when my phone buzzed, when my name came up in conversation, when someone asked how I was doing with that careful tone that meant they already had an answer. I began to feel smaller, not because I lacked strength, but because there was no space left to stand fully. What terrified me wasn't just the judgment. It was the growing sense that if I pushed back, I would lose more than my dignity. I could lose access. I could lose stability. I could lose the fragile balance keeping my life intact. So I stayed quiet. But silence has weight, and the longer I carried it, the clearer it became. This pressure wasn't temporary. It wasn't concern. It wasn't love. It was preparation. And whatever they were preparing for, I was certain of one thing. It wasn't for my benefit. The confrontation didn't start with raised voices. It started with an invitation I couldn't refuse. I was told it would be a quick discussion, nothing serious, just clearing the air. The phrase sounded harmless enough, but my chest tightened the moment I heard it. By then, my body had learned what my mind was still trying to deny. When I arrived, everyone was already there, seated, organized, waiting. There was no space left for me at the table. Someone pulled out a chair from the corner, slightly apart from the others. It was subtle, almost polite, but the message landed instantly. I wasn't part of the group. I was the subject. They began calmly, too calmly. They talked about patterns, about concerns, about how long this had been going on. I listened as my life was summarized in fragments, selective moments stitched together to form a version of me I barely recognized. I tried to interrupt once, just once. I was met with a raised hand and a sigh. Not anger, worse, impatience, like I was slowing down something inevitable. That's when the tone shifted. The concern drained away, replaced by certainty. They spoke with the confidence of people who believed they were doing the right thing. That belief gave them permission to be cruel without seeing themselves that way. Then came the line, not shouted, not whispered, delivered with a small, knowing smile. The idea was clear. I was dramatic, unstable, someone who thrived on sympathy instead of solutions. The room reacted before I could. A few nods, a glance exchanged, the kind of agreement that doesn't need words. Something inside of me cracked. I felt heat rise in my chest, my heart beat loud in my ears, my hands clenched in my lap, nails pressing into my skin, grounding me just enough to stay seated. I wanted to stand, to leave, to say something sharp and unforgettable. But fear held me still. Fear of confirming everything they already believed. Fear of losing what little control I had left. Fear of what would happen if I finally stopped being agreeable. I could feel myself splitting in two. One part of me wanted to defend every sacrifice I had made, every night I went without sleep, every choice that cost me something so my child wouldn't have to feel it. The other part was tired. Bone-deep tired. Tired of explaining, proving, justifying my existence. I looked around the room and realized something devastating. They weren't listening for truth. They were listening for compliance. The more emotional I felt, the calmer they became. My restraint only seemed to encourage them. It was like watching people lean into power they didn't have before, power my silence had given them. They spoke about next steps, about what would be best going forward, about boundaries they were setting for me. For me, as if I was the problem to be managed. I nodded again, not because I agreed, but because I needed time. Time to understand how far this had gone. Time to protect myself. Time to breathe. When it ended, they stood easily, relaxed, satisfied. The tension they'd carried was gone, transferred neatly onto me. As I walked out, my legs felt heavy, like I was moving through water. I realized I was shaking, not from anger, but from the effort it had taken not to break. That night, alone in the dark, I didn't cry right away. I stared at the ceiling and accepted a truth I had been avoiding. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was a power struggle. And I was losing, unless something changed. The shift didn't come with relief. It came with clarity. For days after that confrontation, I moved through life on autopilot. I did what I was supposed to do. I followed routines. I answered messages carefully, choosing neutral words that couldn't be misinterpreted. On the outside, nothing had changed. On the inside, something fundamental had snapped into place. I stopped trying to explain myself, not out of defeat, but because I realized explanation was no longer the currency being accepted. What changed everything was something small, almost forgettable, a detail that didn't line up. I noticed it late one evening while rereading something I'd been sent earlier. At first, I thought I was just tired, that I was overanalyzing, but the more I looked at it, the more the discomfort grew. One statement contradicted another. A concern they had claimed was recent had been discussed long before I was ever told there was a problem. That wasn't concern. That was planning. My chest tightened, not with panic this time, but with focus. I started replaying past moments with new eyes, conversations that felt strange, advice that came too quickly, decisions that were already made before I was asked my opinion. It wasn't random, and I wasn't imagining it. Then something else happened, something I hadn't expected. Someone reached out to me quietly, not publicly, not dramatically, just a brief message that felt cautious, almost nervous. It didn't accuse anyone, it didn't explain much, but it confirmed one thing I had desperately needed to know. I wasn't wrong. There were conversations I hadn't been part of. There were assumptions passed along as facts. There were motivations I had never been told about. I sat there staring at my phone, feeling something unfamiliar rise in me. Not anger, relief. The kind that comes when reality clicks back into place after being distorted for too long. For the first time in months, my thoughts felt like my own again. The fog lifted just enough for me to see the shape of what I was dealing with. This wasn't about my emotional state, it wasn't about my choices, and it definitely wasn't about helping me. It was about control. And once I saw that, the power they held over me began to weaken. I stopped reacting. I listened more than I spoke. I noticed how often they contradicted themselves when they thought I wasn't paying attention. I watched how confident they were when they believed I was still confused, and how uneasy they became when I stayed calm. My silence changed. Before, it had been survival. Now, it was strategy. I began collecting moments, not to use immediately, but to understand the full picture. I trusted my instincts again, slowly, carefully. Each small confirmation strengthened something inside me that had been eroded over time. I wasn't trapped. I had been positioned, and positions can be shifted. What surprised me most was how quickly the balance started to tilt once I stopped feeding the narrative they had built around me. Without my emotional reactions, their authority felt thinner. Without my explanations, their assumptions had nowhere to land. They started watching me the way I had been watching them. That's when I knew the turning point had already passed. They just didn't realize it yet. And for the first time since this began, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I was ready. The truth didn't explode the way I once imagined it would. There was no shouting, no dramatic interruption, no moment where I stood up and demanded attention. It was quieter than that, and far more devastating. The setting was familiar by now. Same room, same faces, same controlled calm that had been used against me before. But this time, something was different. Not in the room, in me. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't trying to prepare the perfect response or rehearse my defense. I sat still, grounded, watching them talk the way they always had, confident, assured, convinced the story belonged to them. They started the same way, a summary, a reminder, a carefully framed concern about my pattern. I noticed how easily they slipped into it, how natural it felt for them to speak about me instead of to me. That's when it happened. Not because I interrupted, but because something they said didn't land the way it used to. They referenced a decision, a timeline, a claim they'd repeated before. And this time, it didn't float uncontested in the air. The inconsistency was small, almost invisible, but it hung there long enough for others to notice. A pause followed. Someone shifted in their seat. Another person frowned, not at me, but at them. I watched the confidence flicker. They tried to recover quickly, offering clarification, softening the edges, but the damage was already done. Once a crack forms, it doesn't need force, it needs light. And suddenly, the questions weren't directed at me anymore. They were subtle at first, curious, neutral, but they kept coming. I stayed quiet. That was the hardest part. Not filling the silence, not rushing to explain, not saving them from their own contradictions the way I always had before. I let them talk, and the more they talked, the clearer it became. Details didn't align, timelines overlapped, motivations blurred. What had once sounded like concern now sounded rehearsed. I saw realization spread across faces I had once searched for empathy. Not sympathy for me, but recognition, the kind that shifts perception permanently. They tried to regain control, to redirect, to bring it back to my emotional responses. But it didn't work, because now the room was paying attention to something else. The structure behind the story, the intention beneath the concern, the power that had been quietly exercised without accountability. I felt something lift from my chest. Not triumph, not vindication, but release. Like I no longer had to carry the weight of proving what had been true all along. No one asked me to defend myself. No one needed me to. The truth was doing what truth does when it's finally allowed to stand on its own. The silence that followed was different from the first one. Not judgmental, not dismissive, heavy with understanding. I looked around the room and saw it clearly for the first time. The narrative that had kept me small no longer belonged to them. It couldn't survive without my confusion, my fear, my constant self-doubt. And those were gone. They avoided my eyes now, not because I had exposed them, but because they had exposed themselves. I didn't smile. I didn't react. I simply sat there, steady, while the version of me they had constructed collapsed under its own weight. That was the moment everything changed. Not because I finally spoke, but because I didn't need to anymore. After that day, nothing needed to be announced. There was no apology delivered the way movies promise, no dramatic admission of guilt, no sudden transformation in the people who had hurt me. What followed was subtler and more real. Distance. Conversations became shorter. Decisions were no longer made on my behalf. The confidence they once carried around me never fully returned. I noticed how carefully they chose their words now, how often they checked themselves before speaking, not out of respect, but awareness. They knew they had been seen. The consequences weren't loud, but they were permanent. The authority they once held over my life quietly dissolved. Their opinions lost weight. Their judgments stopped guiding my choices. The version of me they had created could no longer survive in the light of what was revealed. And I didn't chase closure from them. I found it somewhere else. In the mornings when I woke up without that familiar knot in my chest. In the evenings when my home felt like mine again. In the way my child looked at me, not confused, not afraid, but secure. I didn't explain everything. I didn't need to. Strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just shows up consistently, calmly, and refuses to be bent again. I carried the experience with me, but it no longer carried me. The shame I once felt didn't disappear overnight, but it shifted. I understood then that it was never meant for me in the first place. It had been handed to me because I was quiet enough to hold it, strong enough to endure it, convenient enough to blame. That ended. I stopped trying to be understood by people who benefited from misunderstanding me. I stopped shrinking to make others comfortable. I stopped confusing silence with weakness because now I knew the difference. What surprised me most was the peace. Not happiness, not relief, peace. The kind that comes when you no longer need permission to trust yourself, when your worth isn't negotiated in rooms you didn't ask to enter, when your past pain doesn't define your future posture. I didn't win in the traditional sense, but I reclaimed something far more valuable: my voice, my clarity, my self-respect. And if you're listening to this wondering why parts of it feel uncomfortably familiar, why you've been doubting yourself, minimizing your pain, or staying silent to survive, know this: you're not imagining it. You're not weak, and you're not alone. Sometimes the most powerful response isn't proving them wrong. It's outgrowing the place where they thought they had power over you. If this story resonated with you, subscribe for more real, emotional stories like this. Comment if you've ever been made to feel small for surviving, and share this with someone who needs to hear that silence doesn't mean surrender.